best we can. All right, so hey there, guys. This week we're going to be talking about the outcasts of Poker Flat, A Taste of Liquor Never Brewed, and the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. But before we do that, I wanted to touch on a few things. Now, if you're looking at your Blackboard or Blackboard course and you're seeing no discussion board posts today or for this week, that's because there is none. I wanted you to focus your time and attention on your annotated bibliography. But I definitely still want you to read so that we can have some spirited discussion. Yes, just wanted to kind of put that out there. Before we get started talking about the readings today, I wanted to ask, does anyone have questions about your annotated bibliographies, anything like that? They were due last night, so it should still be fresh in your mind. So if anything comes to mind, definitely let me know. Now is the time.
I just wanted to say with the annotated bibliography, I was just having, I was able to find the information from my research question. It just, there was definitely some times where I felt like I was, where it was just repetitive and there was nothing that I could really do about it.
And that's
You
okay.
know,
Sometimes that'll happen. That'll happen, right? Because a lot of sources interact with the same ideas. Actually, our next essay, which is going to be, or our next big assignment, is the literature review. And that's about how these sources, where they intersect, like which ideas are in common, how they talk about them maybe a little bit differently, right? Where they agree with each other, where they disagree. And so having that repetition helps you figure out for the next assignment, like where that agreement is happening. So I would definitely say write down those points that you're feeling like, oh man, I was writing this again and again and again, because those are going to be the great intersection points for that literature review. Cool. Any other questions or comments even? Okay. All right, good deal. So I do want to point out one thing, and I know that I said it in videos before we had completed the annotated bibliography, but keep this with you when you start working on your other assignments. Okay, it's really, really helpful to be able to, look back at like the pieces of information from your sources that you thought were the most applicable to your research question, because then you don't have to be sitting there like I used to do when I was in your shoes, like rereading these sources 10 times to try to find, like at all different points in the semester. Like, no, you don't have to do that because you picked out the most valuable points already. So don't forget that this assignment exists. This was done specifically so that you could you can have an easier time later on if you look back at this. Okay, that's the reason that I assign it, not to give you extra stuff to do. Okay, I will say when it comes to grading these, especially if they're well done, it does take me a little bit of time because I have to read through like a really well done one. Usually it's like 8 to 9 pages in length. So it might take me a little while to get the grades back to you, but don't worry, you will have them as soon as I can get them completed. It just takes a little bit more time than the usual 1 to 2 day turnaround for assignments for this research project. Okay. All right. So, listen, what's up?
so I was just gonna say, how many pages does the because I know the final research paper has to be 7 pages, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And how many pages is the literary review? If that's yeah,
That
literally
one,
go ahead.
that one should be. Let me verify that super fast because I kind of oscillate back and forth between semesters. I just want to remind myself to make sure I don't give you the wrong information here. Let's see, 2 to 3 pages. So it's not super long. I will say that most people end up writing more than 3 pages, and that's really okay, right? 2, 3 is just like bare bones minimum. If you go 3.5, 4, sometimes that actually works out better in terms of what it gives you going forward, right? So it's all about how much it takes to develop Now, I will say the literature review, you're going to get videos about it later on this week. I'm going to post them for next week. This essay on the surface seems really hard because probably something you've never been asked to do before, right? Essentially, the literature review is an essay that asks you to put ideas in conversation. It asks you to stay out of it. Your opinion doesn't get included. It's very much like a book report almost for your sources, right? Focusing on those points of intersection. And that's the thing that people trip up on. They're like, oh, I don't know how to do that. I've never done it. I'll tell you this. I had to write an essay like this. For the first time, I was toward the end of my undergraduate degree, and I put it off. It needed to be 15 pages. Like I was like, that's ridiculous. I have no idea what I'm doing. I put it off and I wrote it literally in a day because as soon as I started writing, it clicked. So if you're feeling confused, just start writing and give it a go. And then I think you'll see it'll just click in your brain and it'll save you a lot of stress from having to finish it in one day. Longest paper you'll have ever written. Oh, the 7 at the end. You know, though, you're going to have enough content and you are going to know these sources back and front. You're going to know your primary source back and front. It's going to be not as hard as you think. All right. Plus, we're doing all this practice with the discussion boards, like how to intersect with different sources at the same time, how to develop our ideas. So you've got this practice all throughout term. Recommend rereading the book. Yeah, at some point, if you feel like you need to give it a skim through again, maybe closer to the end of term, sure, go for it. If you practiced active reading at the beginning, right, taking notes and things like that, then you're in a much better position than if you just kind of skim through it initially. But yeah, if you start feeling like, oh yeah, maybe I don't remember it as well as I should have, that would definitely help you say, oh, okay, that scene, where did that sit in terms of everything? And then you can easily go to it rather than having to like flip through and figure it out. So it might be very good to reread it again, but really it just depends on the individual, what you feel comfortable with, how much time you have. Any questions about the, no, you're okay. You're okay. Any questions about the literature review? I know we don't have too much information on it except for the assignment requirements and the sample right now, but anything that's sprung to mind, and if you haven't looked at it, that's totally cool. When is due? It's on Blackboard. Offhand, I'm not 100%. Let's see. The literature review draft is due on the 15th of this month, and then the final draft is due. We have a peer review and then a final draft. So I'd say probably the next week after that. For some reason, it's not showing on here. I would say focus your attention on the draft right now because in this class, the draft is going to be like the best draft that you can create. I'm actually going to grade it exactly the same way as I grade final drafts. You're going to get tons of comments, kind of like I did for the one source annotation, to make sure that you are on the right track and you have all the tools you need to revise. And then you'll have comments from your peers for peer review, and then you'll be able to work that into some revision. Yeah, so shoot for that 15th as when you want it to be complete, and then from there it's smooth sailing during your revision, unless the draft that you've submitted wasn't a complete one. All right, so let's get started talking about the readings then. Just to kind of give you an idea of where these sit. Chronologically, these were all written in the 1860s. So Anson wrote her poem right at the beginning of the Civil War. Mark Twain wrote The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County right after the Civil War ends. And then Bret Harte wrote The Outcasts of Poker Flat 4 years after the Civil War ends. A lot of things are going on. There's a lot of social changes happening, political changes. The Transcontinental Railroad is just completed, right? So there is kind of this ability to move from place to place in a way that wasn't available previously. Right now, of course, just because the Transcontinental Railroad was done doesn't mean that it's going everywhere yet. It's literally like one railroad track that runs all the way across the United States. So we do have a lot of people still needing to travel by mule and by horse and things like that. Um, but just you can kind of position in your mind what's going on. Now, this is still before before things like the first commercial light bulb being created, right? So we are not there yet. It's crazy to think it happened in 1879, and then to think that we're turning lights on and off with our phones now, right? Like 150 years later, like it's ridiculous, but awesome. Um, so I just wanted to put those things out there. Now, let's first talk about I Taste a Liquor Never Brewed. This is by Emily Dickinson, a nice short poem. But when it comes to poetry, length doesn't always mean anything because they pack a lot in these little verses here. So, first question I want to ask is this poem actually about liquor? Is anyone actually drinking?
I don't think I'm not good with poetry. I don't think so. No,
Okay, yeah, you're right.
no, like overt mentions of actually drinking. No.
Right, that's exactly because they're not these people aren't drinking alcohol, right? And I want you to keep in mind that even though, yeah, poetry, it's a little bit different, it's not that different. You just have to think about individual words more than sentences or paragraphs, right? So, like, we have this notion of liquor throughout, right? We see the word liquor, we have references to brewing, and we see tankards and vats and alcohol, inebriate, debauchee, right? All these things that we attribute to alcoholism, drinking alcohol, that kind of thing. Um, but at the same time, you can tell, and Jared, you were able to tell that this is not actually about drinking alcohol. Instead, what is it? What is it about? Are we even drinking anything?
I would say no. I think it's more, I think, a metaphor for life, I guess, at least with the words being used, uh, out of the foxglove's door when landlords turn the drunken bee. I don't, I think it's more to do with like, it has a lot of nature themes to it instead of like over drinking, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't tell me you're not good with poetry, right? No, because you are, right? So, you've got all of this idea of, have you ever heard someone say, man, today is intoxicatingly beautiful,
Mhm.
right? Like it's just so pretty. That's what's going on, right? So this intoxication is the beauty of the natural world, like you pointed out. And so, you get the imagery of the tankards, right? A traditional way to drink alcohol, but it's not it's not for alcohol, right? It's just saying that it's so beautiful. It comes from this beautiful cup, right? It's scooped in pearl. This is ornate, and the natural world that's showing this beauty is just as ornate and as something man-made like that, right? So we have that kind of idea. And of course, you can't talk about alcohol and wine without talking about the Rhine, right? That's the place where all of the grapes for the best wines are grown. Um, but it's also part of the natural world. So, you have this thing that's saying, okay, well, even though wine and liquor is natural, right? It all comes from natural things, the way that or the way that Emily Dickinson wants us to interact with the world, the way her speaker, which is basically a poem's narrator, is interacting with these ideas, is that like they are drinking in the world, they are drinking in the visual of the natural world around them. That's why we get inebriate of air am I, right? Just get the speakers getting drunk on just the air, breathing and just being.
Show like drunk
Um,
on life, basically.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Right? It's not even like an activity that the speaker is doing that they're, because usually you'd say that like drunk on life when you're out and about doing amazing things, maybe traveling, going somewhere. Like she's saying, you don't even have to go anywhere for this. You just go outside, right? So, it's this consistent use of drunken imagery to show the beauty and the benefit of, um, engaging with the natural world. And the biggest hint probably is line 9, right? Because we have from inns of molten blue. What is that molten blue?
Maybe like the nighttime.
Could be the nighttime. It's definitely the sky. Um, I would say it probably would be daytime though. And the reason for that is because the bees, they go away during the night, right? They go back to, I don't know what bees do. All I know is that they dance. But that's all I know about bees. Uh, but we've got everything going away at night. It's going home. It's um, away from where you can observe it. So it's probably during the daytime. So imagine this beautiful, bright, like opaquely blue sky. And that's what we've got going on here. What? That was good. You got this good, man.
Poetry's always been like a weakness of mine when it comes to literature classes. Whenever we get to like a poetry unit, it kind of gets more difficult for me to get into it like fully.
I get it. I get it. Now, do you mean when you get into it, like get interested in digging in or
Yeah,
like actually?
it's more like the language used in poetry. I'm not great at the at deciphering the type of language that is used in poetry learned in literature classes.
Mhm.
It's easier for me to decipher like more straightforward path. Like I mean, Call of the Wild, the book I'm reading for the book report, like it's easier for me to read that and extract information that I can use from it than it is like a smaller passage like poetry is.
That's fair. Fair. Um, yeah, poetry. Yeah, Rossi, that's a great point, right? Rossi says poetry is easy for me because it's just a song without music, right? So if you can engage with music and you can make connections with it in that way, then maybe try that same method when it comes to reading. And Bryson, you say it's always been a weakness of mine in school. I had a hard time breaking the poem down and finding the meanings. Yeah, that's fair. But the, important thing to remember is that it's the meaning to you, right? So it's like this person who's going out and engaging with the natural world, the speaker, this is what the natural world means to them, right? And then you have to figure out, okay, well, uh, can I figure that step out, right? Can I figure out the big picture step? Because once you get there, then you can be like, oh, well, then why do we still have all these words that sound like alcohol, right? And you just ask questions and just say, okay, well, why would this be relevant, right? And I'd say Emily Dickinson is a little bit easier than some of the older poetry that they tend to teach in English classes. I'm going to be totally real with you. If I could teach those, like here, if they would let me, I would totally do that. But this is what we get to work with, and I will say that we only do, I think 2 poems in this class, because I'm not the biggest fan of poetry and American literature myself. So you can breathe. It's just a couple. Um, but I really wanted to take the time to dig into this one specifically because it's shorter. It's pretty straightforward. Um, and then, except for the last stanza, which is a little bit deeper, a little bit harder to dig into, which we're going to get to in a second. Um, but there's not too much of that going on in this class, at least. So let's look at that last stanza, right? Till seraphs swing their snowy hats and saints to windows run to see the little tippler leaning against the sun. All right, Sarah.
That is that religious? I always, whenever I hear seraph, I think of religious things.
Yeah, it is religious,
Angels.
absolutely. Yeah, it's an angel,
Okay.
right? Seraphs are angels, right? So if seraphs are angels, then what snowy hat are they swinging? Like, picture an angel in your mind. What's a snowy hat that an angel has? Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a halo, right? So you have these angels who have their halos, um, and we've got that, right? They're swinging them. So swinging, does that sound like they're excited? Does that sound like, ah, yeah, that's the thing. Poetry, it's not hard. You just have to break it down into its most basic. So, okay, if they're swinging their halos around, is this celebratory? Is this something that they're mourning? Like, what are we? What emotion are we feeling from this? Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's celebratory, right? I don't know anyone who swings things around when they're upset. I mean, unless they're violently angry, and in that case, like, get away from them. Right? No, but you're absolutely right, right? So they're swinging their snowy hat. Imagine you're at a sporting event and you've got a hat on, and something amazing happens and you just like chuck your hat off, right? It's kind of the same idea. So, okay, so we've got these angels swinging their snowy hats, and now we have saints. Saints to windows run. What? What is this? Saints are running to windows, but like, are saints alive?
I I guess like running to windows maybe to observe if I'm taking it literally. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. So it's all about observation for sure. Now, have there ever a place where you've seen saints and windows together?
Yeah,
Remember, we just talked about angels.
the glass in a church. I forget the actual name for it. The oh god, what's the actual name? Stained glass.
You're
There
talking,
we go. Stained glass windows.
yep, absolutely. Right. So we've got stained glass windows, right? The saints running to the stained glass, right, in a cathedral. Um, and so now we have all this religious imagery, right? We've got the angels swinging their halos. We have the saints from their position in the stained glass, like they weren't there before. They're running to the stained glass to look out. So this is giving them more agency than we typically do, because like stained glass doesn't move. This isn't Harry Potter. Um, but we've got the saints now running to the windows, and they want to see the little tippler leaning against the sun. Okay, so now I need to know what a tippler is. Anybody have any ideas?
Someone who drinks.
It's prob-
I looked that
yes,
up.
yes, you're exactly right. Right, so it's someone who drinks, right? So to see the little tippler leaning against the sun, though, like if you do that, you're gonna go on fire. So like, what's going on there? Is it like literally leaning against the sun?
No, probably just like going towards the sun. Like maybe like sort of I don't know, like it's hard to put into words. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure. The only thing I can like maybe oh oh sorry, I thought my computer just froze.
Oh
uh,
no.
the only thing I can think of is maybe just like going towards the sunset, like in a if I'm taking it literally, but it's probably something else to do with it.
Okay. Yeah, so it definitely has to do with observing someone doing something in relation to the sun. So you're on the right track with that. I want to ask you, in terms of religion, what is the sun often a symbol for? And I don't mean like, I know we have a lot of like Catholic and Christian imagery, but it doesn't even necessarily need to be that. There's some imagery like broader that the sun symbolizes. Anything you could think of? Okay, the Trinity, right? So you're thinking, kind of the symbol of the cross with the sun coming behind it. Is that what you're going for, Bryson? Okay, yeah. And so, okay, even in this case, even in the case of the Trinity, the sun is like what? Because I think you're right, but we need to take it one step further. I mean, you can dig back into, like, if you're into Egyptian mythology and stuff like that, like this is, you know, over that as well. Like it goes back. Yeah, Rossi, you're absolutely right. Right. So it's God more generally, right? So in terms of the Trinity, right, oh gosh, I have to think back to like Sunday school from when I was younger. What's it like, the light of truth or something like that? So essentially like the knowledge of everything, of all things, which would then be God, right? So we see then, so we've got angels swinging their snowy hats, right? Angels swinging their halos, saints running to windows to see the person drinking who is like leaning against the sun, moving closer to God. Okay, no, perfect, Bryson. No, you're totally right. You're totally right. Right. So exactly, Rusty, you're on the right track there too, for sure. Right. So we have this kind of um glorification. Right? We are celebrating the fact that this person is now against the sun, right? Getting closer and closer and closer to God, to like the capital T truth of behind religion, right? And so the saints are watching because the saints are people who've done amazing things. For the world, we've got the angels, these holy beings who are celebrating and watching. See this person who's been drinking in the world, right? The natural world, getting closer and closer, right? To to the word, to whatever it is, however you want to describe this sort of divine idea, right? All in all, what is Emily Dickinson saying in this poem? If we had to like narrow it down to a couple of sentences. Sure. So what is, like, if I asked you like the theme of the poem, right? Like how we move through the idea about nature and and these different elements of the natural world, and then moving into this religious iconography, like what would the overarching theme be if you had to sum it up in just a couple of sentences?
I can't really say it's much, or I can't really say in a couple sentences really. But what I can say is it's got a more general positive tone, throughout the poem. How well, just from the very end, that's where I really noticed that. Wait a second. Yes. Okay. I think it's Rosie, right? Or is it Rossi?
I'm not sure. I've never heard it pronounced. So if you could give a phonetic spelling, that would be amazing. So it's Rossi. Is that is that right?
Yeah, I think it's Rossi. I think she's definitely right about the appreciating the nature and the world God created. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's
just
like
not
the
really
overall
sure what
theme.
else to. Yeah.
Right? Because we see, like, to walk us through it, right? We see the benefits. We see that this liquor the nature provides is nothing that we've ever tasted before, nothing that something man made could ever sustain, right? This is better. And we see how it affects the individual in the second stanza. No worries, Jared, you're good. So we see how it affects the individual in the second stanza, and then almost as if they kind of separate themselves and become an observer in the third, right? And then we see, like, in terms of the big picture, right? We see that these people or that the natural world should be revered just like it should be, just like God should be revered, right? So that's where Rossi's point comes in about appreciating nature and the world God created, right? Linking those two things together, um, to really hammer that point home that the natural world is, or experiencing the natural world is a religious experience. Does that make sense, you guys? Good deal. Good deal. Hopefully, we're feeling a little more comfortable with poetry now. I know it was just one poem, but I don't know. This one is fun to do. I don't know. So let's move into The Outcasts of Poker Flat. I am purposefully leaving Mark Twain's short story for last because it is my least favorite one that we talk about all term. And Simon Wheeler, I find him just as boring as the narrator does. So, The Outcasts of Poker Flat. What do we know about John Oakhurst as a character? Like, who is he by a casual observer?
Big
Who is
gambler.
he once you get to know him?
I know from like first impressions he's like a heavy gambler,
Mm-hmm.
and the vibe isn't. He's been exiled. I didn't have a lot of time to. I just realized since we didn't have a discussion question this week, I forgot that we had readings because I was working on the bibliography. So I tried to read through them a bit
Mm-hmm.
this morning. But from first
Sure.
impressions, he was like a serial gambler who'd kind of been gotten on the wrong side of the sort of, I guess, committee in the town he's in Poker
Mm-hmm.
Flat, and
Yeah.
that had led to him being punished for it.
Yeah. Absolutely. So from the outside, right? I mean, the whole first paragraph, right, sets the stage for us, right? We know he's a gambler. But we also see some other interesting things about his character as we move forward, right? Move through and learn about him a little bit more. But we have a town that basically changed overnight, right? It had been a town where people go and just live, um, could have some fun. They can gamble, they can go to a brothel, they can do whatever they want to do. It's like a stereotypical Western city, um, during this time period. Okay. But then it turns into a place where there is a Sabbath lull in the air, which in a settlement unused to Sabbath influences looked ominous, right? So this new religiousness, it's not a word, religiosity, ironically, that's a word. Um, but we now have this new confinement. The speaking is not working for me today, but we now have a new type of confinement happening within the town, right? Whereas previously it really seemed to be kind of live and let live. Now want to follow rules, and they want to follow rules like overnight. So, we see in the third paragraph on the first page, to set kind of what's going on. In point of fact, Poker Flat was after somebody. It had lately suffered the loss of several $1,000s, two valuable horses, and a prominent citizen. It was evoking a spasm of virtuous reaction, quite as lawless and ungovernable as any of the acts that had provoked it. Secret committee had determined to rid the town of all improper persons. Okay, I don't know about you, but that like 4 sentence section made me ask a lot of questions. So the first question I'm going to pose to you guys: why is it that this virtuous reaction is described as quite as lawless and ungovernable as any of the acts that had provoked it?
I guess because of the speed, and also, I guess in the next sentence, explaining the regard of two men hanging from the boughs of a sycamore.
Yeah.
So it seems like it was violent and also very like sudden. So really, is it any better that they hang two men in such a short amount of time than just people gambling and indulging in, I guess, what's the word? Vices. That's the word.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very well said, right? We're, now instead of being a town where people embrace their vices, they are now in a town that, like, the only people that can embrace their vices, I guess, I don't know if you could call this a vice, would be the secret committee that's determined to rid the town of all improper persons, right? So um, how could, like, purging the town in this way be considered a vice, do you think? Is it different from something like gambling, or is it ultimately the same thing?
Ultimately, I'd say it's worse. I mean, gambling, I'm not going to sit here and say that gambling is a good thing to do in your life, but ultimately it's a choice of what you do with your money. But
Mhm.
the hanging of two people, that's pretty, extreme by any measure, no matter what. Like, I mean, I guess that's a whole nother debate, depending on what they've done. But anyway, it's a very violent reaction to something that seems so minor.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, so in a sense, right, if we want to think about it, to kind of make the connection between, gambling as a vice and these sorts of reactions as a potential vice, right? Essentially, vices are something that people fall back on, things that make people feel more comfortable in a given situation, right? We see gambling happening in the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County too, constantly, but we see that as much more of a detriment, right? We see Jim Smiley betting on anything that walks, even, whether or not the pastor's wife is going to die. But here, we know a little bit about Oakhurst, and he starts off seeming like, oh, they have him kind of set up to be like the hardened criminal. But then if we learn about him, we find out that he's like a decent human being. Like, away, he gives the Duchess his mule so that she doesn't have to ride on a, like, a really old one that's not doing so well. So we know that he is more than just a gambler. And at the same time, like, this secret committee has kind of made themselves no more than just the committee, or actually no just, right? They've made them no more than the committee that is set to expel people, right? So they put themselves in the same category, but they're protected. One, they're secret, and two, because they are, sanctioned by the town because of this virtuous feeling, right? In a sense, to kind of come back to the point that Jared was making earlier, right? The reaction to, like a super conservative reaction to a super liberal situation is going to be just as bad, right? You can't flip from one side to the other, just like a super liberal reaction to a super conservative issue is going to be bad, right? It there needs to be moderation. There can't be, we are now going to go and kill and banish people and maybe they'll die in a snowstorm, uh, as a reaction to people who are doing things that are perfectly legal, right? Um, obviously works for Oakhurst. He doesn't drink. He is a decent human being, right? We find out that he wins a lot of money off Tom, and at the end of the night, he pulls Tom aside and says, "You're an awful gambler. Never do this again. Take your money back." Right? So just because he is associated with this vice, and just because the Duchess and Mother Shipton are associated with their vices, right? Because they're a prostitute and a madam, uh, that doesn't make them worse people. That just is the thing that they choose to do with their life, or have to do with their life. So let's kind of talk a little bit about, let's see, where was the next thing here? Yeah, second page. They are they're walking, right? They're trying to get to Sandy Bar because they're now exiled from Poker Flat. They're not allowed to come back. They could be killed if they return, right? So that's a no go. And so they're going to Sandy Bar, which apparently is not hit by the same virtuous reaction to these vices. And they don't have much food, they don't have, um, anything to kind of keep them going except liquor, right? And so we see about halfway through page 2. But they were furnished with liquor, which in this emergency stood them in place of food, fuel, rest, and prescience. In spite of his remonstrances, it was not long before they were more or less under its influences. So Oakhurst is trying to be the responsible adult in this situation and say, guys, like, we really need to keep our heads about this. Like, we can't just like hang out. We really have to get to Sandy Bar. This is not a good situation. And of course, we know that they get snowed in, right? That's ultimately what ends up happening here. They get snowed in, um, and we see they interact with Tom and Piney. Tell me a little about Tom and Piney. We first meet them on page 3, if that helps. Well, the end of page 2, but we find out more about them on 3.
What I noticed is he's like an innocent, he's portrayed as the innocent man, you know. I just, like I said earlier before, I just haven't really gotten to read these, so I'm just trying to, look and notice something. He's just the innocent, seen as the innocent man.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Jared just made a point that I'm cutting in and out. Is anybody else noticing that too, or is that just his internet?
Just me.
Okay. So yeah, so Tom is the innocent. We know that they see Piney as an innocent too, because on page 5, the Mother Shipton set herself to the task of amusing the child, as she and the Duchess were pleased to call Piney, right? So this notion of her being a child, right? We know that she's 15. We know a little bit about her description, um, and we know that she's running away to get married to Tom, right? This is what we know about Piney. Now, when we first meet her, we see Mr. Oakhurst. This is on page 3. Mr. Oakhurst seldom troubled himself with sentiment, still less with propriety, but he had a vague idea that the situation was not fortunate, meaning Tom and Piney's, um, they're going from Sandy Bar to Poker Flat. What could that mean? The situation was not fortunate. If it helps, Uncle Billy figured it out too, but before he could say anything out loud, Oakhurst kicked him and he stopped. What is this not fortunate? Nothing? Okay. So it could go a few ways, right? It's not fortunate because they ran away together. Okay, so we have, Piney um, and Tom running away from Sandy Bar because we find out a little bit earlier on page 3 that they had been engaged a long time, but Old Woods had objected, and so they ran away and were going to Poker Flat married, right? So it could just be that their families were not supportive of their marriage, right? More likely, the situation was not fortunate, and the fact that Uncle Billy figured this out and he's drunk all the time um, suggests that maybe Piney was pregnant, right? And so it's a little bit interesting that the Duchess and Mother Shipton would call Piney the child, and that she would be described as the virgin later on in the story, right? So we have the it's also a little bit interesting that she used to wait the tables at Temperance House, right? Because Temperance would be suggesting to like um, patience, mediation, right? All of this, or not mediation, moderation. So, she's a bit of an enigma, Piney. Um, but definitely something that we need to keep in mind as we're interacting with her, especially because later we see that the Duchess asks Piney on page 7, Piney, can you pray? And Piney just says, no, dear. That's it. So, like, it's kind of interesting. Does that suggest anything about Piney? Or I guess maybe about Sandy Bar? Yeah, Rusty, you're absolutely right. It kind of implies that she might have sinned, for sure. Right? So, we have this idea that she may have sinned, right? Which would go into to work with the idea that she may be pregnant, which could also work with the idea that she's not pregnant, but she's running away against her father's wishes. Like all of this is all rolled into one here. Um, so we do have that constant suggestion that Penny might not be as innocent as suggested, and maybe neither is Tom. Also would suggest that maybe Sandy Bar isn't quite as liberal as other places could be, maybe as Poker Flat was previously. So if if with all these things in mind, Tom and Piney to Poker Flat with this new virtuosity, however you want to say it, are they going to be welcomed with open arms, knowing that she's possibly pregnant, knowing that they've run away, like all of these things?
Probably not. No, or taking all that into consideration, and I guess the time period, which kind of places them in an awkward situation. Like that nowadays might, it's not, socially like fully accepted, but like back then you had to assume that it was kind of a red flag for a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And this town that's just expelling people, even people like Oakhurst who are good people, the Duchess, who obviously is, a good person, Mother Shipton, who sacrifices herself, and then the food to Piney and the Duchess, right? These are good people who do jobs that are considered unwanted by the community. Um, Okay, so you think a story called The Crucible. Yeah, absolutely. Right? If do you want to give us a rundown on what The Crucible is? Because I think that that's a good connection here.
Basically, the Crucible is it's set in like the I believe it's like the Puritan times, and it's in a town called Salem, I think Massachusetts, correct?
Hmm.
And basically basically the story about this one man named John Proctor, and I think the other lady whose name was Anne Hutchinson. And John Proctor was married to this one person and committed adultery with Anne Hutchinson, which was this one girl who was a lot younger. A lot younger. He had committed adultery, and had ended up getting exiled and hung. So
Okay.
I thought of so I when I heard that, I just immediately thought of that.
Okay. I think that's a really great connection. The Crucible also has undertones of the Salem witch trials and things like that happening in there as well. But you're absolutely right, and that makes a lot of sense, right? It's this idea, but actually, interestingly enough, it was written around the same time period. So, these kinds of thoughts are in people's minds. Um, and so, there's this need to bring virtue to a community, right? However that may be, right? It's this overreaction to help solve a problem. Okay, so let's see. Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Um, so the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the outcasts of Poker Flat is the end, right? We know that Tom and Oakhurst set off Oakhurst is going to help Tom, like show him the path to get back to Poker Flat. And he's supposed to come back, and he never does. But what we do find out is that the Duchess and Piney find fuel for the fire lined up outside their cabin, right? And who puts that there? Who can we assume puts that there? Because I mean, like, would have, right? Oakhurst isn't around. Tom left. They're the only two. Did Uncle Billy come back and put the firewood there? All right, since we're running a little low on time. Okay, Jared, you're not sure? Yeah, so what ended up happening here is that before he left, Oakhurst knew he wasn't planning to come back. Okay, he had planned suicide before he left the girls. Okay, so what he did to make sure they were safe and they were protected as best as he could, he left firewood for them. But he didn't want to continue the struggle against the elements and against not having food. So he leaves firewood for them. They see it, they know what happened because he didn't come back. They were expecting him to come back. This also goes into why he kissed the Duchess goodbye, right? This wasn't just a kiss of the Duchess, right? This wasn't continuing the ruse that they were married. This was him having one last opportunity to live life before he ended up killing himself and kind of taking himself out of this bad situation. So, of course, in typical Oakhurst fashion, we see that he leaves his suicide note on the deuce of clubs, okay, pinned to the bark with a Bowie knife. And it said, "Beneath this tree lies the body of John Oakhurst, who struck a streak of bad luck on the 23rd of December, 1850, and handed in his checks on the 7th of December, 1850. Now, the story describes him as someone who was at once the strongest and yet the weakest of the outcasts of Poker Flat. How can he be both the strongest and the weakest?
I guess they could describe him as strong in the sense that he, I guess, unintentionally, well, maybe not unintentionally, he sort of led them to where they were in that point and was trying to look out for them throughout the entire journey. But then I guess weakest, and I don't, obviously no personal belief in this sentence, the fact that he went off and planned not to return and to commit suicide at that point, that could point to a weakness,
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right? So this idea that he recognized he would not be capable of returning and benefiting the community that they built at the camp, right? So instead of pushing through, right, trying to make the best of it, he recognized that he was down on his luck. He couldn't break his unlucky streak, right? A gambler right until the end, essentially. He ends up gambling with his life as well. So, absolutely well said, Jared. I like how you said that. All right, so it is 1 o'clock. So if you guys, we're going to wrap up, but if anyone has any questions or anything like that, definitely please hang out. Let me know. We can talk. Otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you guys next Wednesday.